Maybe you're eating an apple or a piece of lettuce right now. Could be a broccoli stem or perhaps a lovely juicy tomato. If you are you wondering how intelligent that plant is? I'd guess not. But today I have a conversation that might make you think twice. Zoë Schlanger has written an eye-opening book on the topic. She's also a science writer for The Atlantic. My conversation starts with something most of us are probably familiar with. A lonely old sweet potato sitting on the kitchen counter.
I had a huge pot of soil left over from a plant I'd given a friend, and I also had a sweet potato on my counter that had sprouted from all of its eyes, as anyone who sometimes procrastinates eating a sweet potato can probably relate to.
Your first instinct might be to cut the sprouts off, toss them in the garbage and continue on. But Zoë decided to plant hers and see what would happen.
I just plunked it into this pot of good potting soil, and within a couple of days, it was, had tendrils poking out through the soil that started to make its way across my kitchen.
Long vines started growing, crawling across the floor. Within 2 weeks, it had climbed up the legs of a table, across a butcher block, and started winding around a drawer handle.
And I delayed for a very long time getting the thing I needed out of this drawer because I didn't want to disturb this incredible plant, but it really helped me fall in love with vines. And I think vines in particular are incredible plants for watching a plant make a decision. They're climbing over obstacles, and they're sensing light patterns, and they're trying things, and then if those things fail, like if the support is not strong enough, they will sort of find something else.
What Zoë noticed was not just that the sweet potato vine was growing, but it was actively making choices, and it was solving problems in real time. And this decision-making ability, Zoë learned, can be found in plants all around us.
Plants are making decisions constantly. They are weighing multiple variables in their environment. They're choosing where to grow. They're choosing how and with whom and when to reproduce. They're choosing, how dark or light to make their leaves so that they absorb the right amount of sunlight. And those are just a few of the trillions of micro decisions a plant is making throughout its life.
This idea that plants are actively making choices is in the middle of an emerging field of research called plant intelligence. Biologists are looking into how plants can have memories, communicate with each other, and in some cases even experience senses like hearing and touch. Zoë Schlanger's book is called The Light Eaters: How the Unseen World of Plant Intelligence Offers a New Understanding of Life on Earth. Today's episode is my conversation with Zoë about what it means for a plant to be intelligent, even without a brain, and how this revolutionary field of research might help us look at plant life a little differently. You may never walk through the woods in the same way again. From KURW in Seattle and Chris Morgan Wildlife, welcome to the wild. Zoë, thanks so much for being here.
It's such a delight to be here. Thanks for having me.
This is such a fascinating topic. I'm going to dive right into it because I've got a lot of questions for you. First off, though, I'm sure the burning question for a lot of people is simple question: what's so interesting about plants?
Oh, God, plants are so magnificent. They are the basis for our entire world. I mean, just to start with, just to take a step back to the thing we all learned probably in middle school biology, but they provide all of the oxygen that we breathe and all of the sugars that we metabolize that keep our bodies running. They were all first synthesized, spun out of absolutely thin air in the body of a plant. So that's just the first thing. But honestly, they're so much more dynamic than I realized before starting this reporting process. They are out there perpetuating wild plant dramas everywhere you could imagine.
Wow, it sounds like a dramatic world when you say it like that.
Totally, it is.
Just sprang to mind that, when was that series that was done by the BBC about, was it Green Planet, when they had all of that time-lapse, incredible, dynamic, really groundbreaking time-lapse photography, didn't they, that really did portray these plants like they were alive and kicking and had lived in this community of cutthroat community sometimes. And yeah, that just sprang to mind as you were describing it.
Exactly. That's that Attenborough series. It's beautiful, and really gets at this idea that plants are actually moving constantly. They're just moving at a time scale that's slower than ours, so we don't, have the patience as human animals to pay attention to that, but they are relentlessly moving. Growth is a form of constant movement, and they're doing it in these genius ways to, perpetuate and thrive in complicated circumstances.
What you're getting at is that there is more than meets the eye when it comes to plants and what they're capable of. You wrote about this concept of plant blindness. Can you explain what that is?
Plant blindness is this generalized inability to see plants as individual organisms that botanists might say afflict our society in a general sense. Of course, this doesn't apply to everyone. Lots of people are true plant lovers, gardeners, horticulturalists, but it's this idea that we as humans are more inclined to differentiate between many species of dog, but are unable to tell the difference between a pair of trees or wheat and rye, or don't even see this sort of wash of green in our backyard as differentiated individual species with dramatically different evolutionary histories, different lifestyles, different proclivities, which is in fact what is always there. Each of these species of plants are as different as, a toucan is from a polar bear, but it's this particular human affliction, which is a social affliction. It's not, it's about what cultures we've been raised in, what sort of received philosophies of understanding we've grown up within that prevent us from kind of seeing this individuality and vibrancy of the plants all around us.
Right. Maybe your work will help sort of reveal this mysterious world that most people walk by. We'll come back to that a bit later on, because I love the philosophies that you're touching upon there. Where did this plant blindness come from? But we're here first, before we get to that more, to talk about plant intelligence. How do you define intelligence when it comes to a plant?
So intelligence as a word has no set scientific definition. We have not settled as humans on what intelligence truly means. There's no single definition for it, which makes it a very tricky thing to parse in anything, but perhaps especially in plants, a creature that does not have a brain or a centralized nervous system in the way we think of ours, has no face, and has been sort of neglected from or put outside of this realm of things we think of as intelligent for a very long time, at least in the West. And one way to define intelligence loosely, in a basic sense, is by looking at the Latin root of the word. It comes from interlegere, which means to choose between. So it's about making a decision. The capacity to make wise decisions could be one way to define intelligence. And when you think of intelligence that way, it becomes impossible not to widen the circle of what we consider intelligence to include plants.
Yes, very interesting. You're opening my eyes here. I love the root word of intelligence. That's kind of interesting. Can you tell us the story that there's a plant that you talk about and the sound of running water?
Yes, right. So a few years ago, a researcher put out a paper that found that plants' roots would seek out just the audio recording of running water. They would grow towards the audio recording of running water, unless, of course, there was actual moisture for the plant to pursue instead. So this is incredible and yet unsurprising, because root intrusion is a huge problem in cities. It's massive amounts of municipal dollars go towards fixing burst pipes that have been burst because a tree root has stuck itself inside of them. But what was amazing about this study is that we already know roots are incredibly good at sensing even the slightest bit of moisture very far away and moving towards that. But the idea that they could sense the vibrations, the acoustic vibrations of the sound of the running water is just remarkable. And it's a reminder also that, plants are very much acoustically in touch. There's a whole world of study that's being born right now called phytoacoustics that looks at how plants respond to sound. But the reality here is that sound to a plant is pure vibration. It's a physical stimulus. And we're finding that plants are responding to sound in their environment all of the time, which sort of makes sense. They evolved alongside many ecological sounds, and it would be not fortuitous for them to not be able to use that information to thrive.
Do you know how they did that research, how they figured that out? What methods were they using?
I believe the researcher in this case created a sort of Y maze, which is something that is used to test animal senses as well. You make a maze for a mouse and put different stimulus in different arms of the maze. In this case, it was sort of this Y shape, upside down Y shape maze, so that the plant kind of looked like it was wearing these plastic pants that were just these two tubes. And on the end of one tube, there was different setups, but there could be like a dish of water or some actual running water. On the other end, there could be the sound, the recording of the running water, and then doing different setups where sometimes there was nothing on one end, but the sound of the recording water on the other end, and then just watching how the roots developed, what direction they chose to grow in, over and over and over again, and sort of taking the average of all of those actions.
Right, and it was the sound, literally the sound of running water that plant was drawn to when there was an absence of any moisture anywhere else. It went to that sound rather than anywhere else.
Exactly.
Amazing.
And then when there was moisture, they were able to triage that. When there's a guaranteed drink, they were still able to then decide to go towards the actual moisture instead of the sound of it. And this is in line with other acoustic experiments going on, like one remarkable one a couple of years ago on evening primrose, which is this low-growing buttercup yellow little flower. Researchers found that it would increase the sweetness of its nectar by 3 times when it was exposed to just the sound of a bumblebee flying. The flight of the bumblebee or the buzzing of the bumblebee would provoke this nectar sweetening response, and that was clearly to attract their pollinator more efficiently.
Interesting.
But it didn't require any contact at all. It was just the acoustic vibration.
Wow. What other behaviors make you and researchers think that plants are intelligent? Those are a couple of amazing examples. Anything else that springs to mind?
Absolutely. I love thinking about the ways that plants manipulate other creatures to do their bidding. I think thinking about plant manipulation is an amazing feat of potential intelligence. One case is the yellow monkey flower, which I know you have out west. I've seen it in the wild growing in the Northwest. And the yellow monkey flower, produces pollen to entice pollinators. And bees, their pollinators, seem to have a capacity to sense whether the flower is full of pollen or not. So there's some kind of chemical signal coming off the flower that bees are using as a sort of pre-screening process to see whether it's worth landing on that flower or not. And the yellow monkey flower, evolutionarily speaking, has taken note of this pre-screening process and is capable of producing that chemical signal of lots of pollen in their flower without actually producing the pollen.
Wow.
Producing pollen is an extremely energetically taxing activity. It takes a lot of energy. And they found a way to sort of dupe that pre-screening process and end up, with a bait and switch for this bumblebee without having to put in the effort at all. So they get pollinated and the bee goes off with nothing.
Cunning, so cunning. Like you just used the word manipulative when it comes to a plant. That's fascinating. Does that fall under a category of that intelligence? Does that make that plant species intelligent because it's manipulating the life of that bee that's visiting?
Well, I think manipulation is an interesting word because it is a word that scientists use, but it has these kind of negative connotations, this kind of scheming, malevolent quality, which of course we can't really ascribe to a plant. We can't assume any emotions in the background here. But it's this sort of capacity to use other animals as tools, using other organisms to get something they need done. And when we see other creatures using tools, we certainly suggest that's a form of intelligence. There's videos in my feed of like crows, using sticks or something to get a pebble out of a box, or folks creating these trick contraptions to see what animals will do. Raccoons finding ways to open latched garbage cans, things like that. And we look at that and go, wow, what clever creatures. But plants are using animals to do their bidding all of the time. They use insects to get pollinated. They use insects for defense. There's a whole group of plants that are called ant plants by scientists because they conscript ants to do things like be their bodyguards by sort of constantly feeding them extra floral nectar, these little droplets of sugar that then they get the ants hooked on this sugary nectar, and the ants protect them from other invaders for the rest of their lives. So you see, there's all these incredible tool-using capacities plants can have.
You certainly wouldn't think of a plant as falling under the tool-using category of creatures on the planet, would you? That's a really interesting way of looking at it. So related to all this and what's intelligence and what is not, so there's this book, right, came out in the 70s, The Secret Life of Plants. I can see you reacting to this question before I've asked it. Any thoughts on that one, on that book?
Yes, absolutely. So The Secret Life of Plants came out in 1973, and it is sort of has haunted my entire book process because it left this long shadow on all of botanical science for about 30 years. It was a massive success in the 70s. Everyone was reading it, and that had never happened before in a work of popular journalism about plants. And the problem was that it was this sort of fabulous collection of myths. I don't know if you've heard about the idea that plants enjoy classical music but don't like rock and roll. That was something posited in this book. There was also a scene in which a former CIA agent strapped a polygraph test to his houseplant and then pictured setting the plant on fire. And the polygraph test apparently went wild, which suggested the plant was reading his malevolent thoughts. And so these concepts were extremely sticky.
Great
on
experiments, I got to say, very imaginative.
Very entertaining, absolutely. The problem was they couldn't be reproduced and for all intents and purposes are false. I will say there was a film made of this book in which Stevie Wonder made the soundtrack, and I just have to put a plug in for that album. It's really fantastic. But aside from that, mostly this book was massively damaging because what happened was the funding boards, the National Science Foundation, the groups that fund American research got very scared or started to shy away from funding botanical research that had any whiff of being about plants being behaving organisms, which is very much the thing that I'm thinking about now. It's taken 30, 35, 40 years for the kind of stain of this to wear off of the sciences. This taboo has since loosened its grip a bit, and that's why we have this onslaught of incredible research that I was able to write a book from just in the last 5, 10, 15 years. But it can't be overstated what can happen when incorrect science gets put out there. And it's resulted in, scientists are always conservative people. They don't like talking about science unless they're absolutely sure of it, whether it's been peer-reviewed, whether it's been reproduced. But especially once you're stepping into this realm of plant intelligence and even consciousness discussions from a scientific standpoint, that can be really tough territory because no one wants to have a second Secret Life of Plants situation unfold.
Right, understandable. I think the effects are still clear. It's so funny, when we were getting ready for this interview, our editor Jim said that he still leaves music on in his house for his plants when he leaves sometimes. In his case, he said it's jazz. And he said it's because of The Secret Life of Plants.
No way.
It's still happening.
Wow.
And then I chatted to my son the other night, and he talked about an experiment that they did on that show Mythbusters. You know, that giant, I think it's Discovery Channel show, Mythbusters, and they were playing music to plants. And my son's recollection was that the most popular music for the plants in that experiment was Metallica. But
Metalheads.
He may have that wrong, plants. But it was these things stick with human minds, don't they? Yeah.
That's just incredible. Well, it's interesting because, of course, now science is finding plants do respond to sound, but there's no reason to think that they've evolved to respond to music or human speech because this is all very recent for their, in terms of their evolutionary history. But of course, they do respond to sounds that are ecologically relevant to them, like a caterpillar chewing or a bee buzzing or water running.
Or water running. Metallica doesn't remind me of water running, so that doesn't fit, does it? But it's clear that not everyone agrees about using phrases like plant intelligence. I mean, that seems clear from what you're saying. What are the different camps saying when you say plants have intelligence? Discuss. What are the scientists on each camp saying?
Well, I'll start by saying the vast majority of scientists are sort of sitting in the middle and not making comments about this. And they're just going about their work and coming up with incredible studies that show plants do amazing things without having to talk about intelligence at all. But on either side of them are two camps. One that says it's absolutely ridiculous to ascribe consciousness or intelligence to plants. These are human notions. How could we lay them on a whole category of life that does not have a brain, does not have a face, does not have emotions in the way that we can find or register them? Why would we bother doing that? Plants are incredible exactly for what they are, and what they are is incredibly radically different from us, and we should respect that by not laying these human notions upon them. And then, on the other side, are scientists who are saying it's a strange notion of sort of human supremacy to imagine that we are the only creatures with capabilities like intelligence and consciousness. And, we're, of course, in the business of sort of naming a few other species we think also have them, dolphins, dogs, primates. But for the most part, we keep this circle quite tight and wrapped around ourselves of what does and doesn't have intelligence and consciousness. And so these pro-plant intelligence botanists would say that's ridiculous. Intelligence, like anything else in evolution, is likely something that arose out of a need. And who's to say that plants didn't also have that evolutionary heritage of needing to develop intelligent systems to thrive and survive. And their intelligence may look quite different from our own, even radically different. They have radically different senses in some areas, like chemical synthesis, for example, making these gases to attract different creatures. But that doesn't make it any less intelligent than our own form. So it's this question of worldview, really, more than science. It's about what box you want to put plants in your mind, and whether or not we can really hold plants as, on the one hand, radically different from us and complex in ways that our human brains are only beginning to understand and may never fully understand, and on the other, having certain parallel systems to our own, like the capacity to experience touch and react to it, the capacity to experience sound and react to it, the capacity to have, social lives and family structures, in a sense, in terms of how they behave with each other. So this is hard. This is just holding a lot of complexity in mind to even attempt to think about them as intelligent. But these scientists say it's time we start doing that.
Very interesting. It's like a social science on top of a botanical science and a science, an ecological science, isn't it? When you start to question why have we started to treat plants and look at plants and other non-human creatures and species in the way that we do? It's a pretty arrogant position that we have, isn't it? Let's talk about some of the things you touched on there about these examples that are like senses, touch and decision-making and memory and communication, some of these things that denote plant intelligence. But first, how can a plant be intelligent if it doesn't have a brain?
This is you're touching the red-hot core of the debate here. Exactly. How could it do this without a brain? And this is a profound mystery in many respects. For example, in the world of plant touch sensing, in the research into how plants translate physical touch, the experience of, let's say, being bitten by a caterpillar or a leaf being torn or being pinched, how they transmit that physical stimulus into a decision on the part of the entire plant body is largely a mystery because there is no centralized processing that we know of. There's no brain. The signal of that touch sort of ripples through the plant, and we can now see that. I was able to see that in a lab in Wisconsin because of fluorescent green proteins that had been imbued in a plant to study this signal moving of the touch through the body.
Tell me about that. What happened in the lab? That's curious.
So I got to go to the lab of a researcher named Simon Gilroy at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he studies how plants respond to touch. And him and his lab mates had imbued these little Arabidopsis plants, little thale cress plants and tobacco plants, with something that glows green when calcium is moving through a cell. And the idea is that the calcium is moving through a cell after the cell has been crushed by something like, an aggressive touch, in this case, a pinch from my tweezers. And that creates this chain reaction to other cells. So you can actually watch. I was in this dark microscope room and been handed a pair of tweezers by Simon Gilroy's person in his lab. And she said, go at it, really pinch this plant hard. And the first time I pinched it too gingerly because it was this sort of funny thing of learning all about plant sensing and then being told to injure a plant. And then I thought about the fact that I'd eaten a salad earlier that day, and then that gave me the courage to actually pinch it quite hard. And we all sat in that room and watched the monitor of what was happening under the microscope. This green glow was emanating out from the place that I had pinched the plant and traveling along the plant's vein system, that sort of midrib of the leaf and the smaller ribs that, go through the leaf that then travel down to the rest of the plant. And within about 2 minutes, this green glow had reached the entire plant. The whole plant was glowing, which,
wow,
according to Simon's research, means the entire plant is now aware, so to speak, of my pinch, and was presumably now responding by doing things like boosting its immune system, perhaps, like in many plants, making its leaves bitter, or starting the process of thickening the leaves, doing these various things that plants do in response to an attack. So we know exactly the fact that the sensing is possible and the fact that the outcome, the action on the part of the plant is sensible according to what's happening. But we don't know how those two things meet. We don't know how this physical action of me hurting the plant produces that response, because there is no brain in which, we're used to all of our information and decisioning is transmitted through and transformed by our brain into a response. Plants simply don't have that.
Right.
So it is a grand mystery.
It sounds like it. It sounds like in some ways the plant's electrical system is similar to the human nervous system, but completely different as well.
Right. So part of this research is into how the plant uses electrical impulses in signaling. Now, we know that plants are fabulously electrical beings, as are we, of course, but there are no neurons or synapses in a plant. And yet that there are many parts of a plant's life that seem to be mediated by electricity. For example, a Venus flytrap closing its trap, that's due to an electrical impulse that's produced right before it closes its trap. There's many things like that. And this work sort of brings up questions that are being debated in botany now about whether or not plants could be said to have some kind of nervous system, that it's not maybe the same kind of nervous system as us, but a sort of analogous structure, because you can look at this vein system and this signaling system and see that it has something to do with electricity, and it becomes very hard not to imagine that as a sort of nervous system, a plant nervous system, not a human one. But
for sure, but there are enough analogies there for you to sort of almost label it like that, aren't there? That makes total sense.
Exactly.
We'll be right back after the break. From your book, I know that there are these categories that come up, when we pick apart what intelligence is, including the senses like touch that we've been talking about, and memory and decision-making and communication. Maybe we could walk through a couple more of these, So how do plants communicate with each other?
Plants communicate with each other primarily through chemical compounds that they synthesize in their bodies for specific actions or specific circumstances, and then release through these pores on their leaves. And those float in the air, and other plants in the vicinity take them up through their pores and then do something with them. So often this is in response to attack. We've known since the late 80s that plants in, let's say, a forest of trees, if some trees are under caterpillar attack, they are capable of producing these compounds that can alert trees very far away to the onset of this attack, and those trees in turn boost their immune systems to try and stave off the worst effects of the
They get a message. They get a message from a tree that's being attacked by a caterpillar.
Right, exactly. So it's
through
advanced
the air,
warning.
For sure, through the air.
For sure, through the air. Yeah. So these experiments came after scientists had first discovered that there was some kind of root-to-root signaling under the ground between plants, but they were noticing these trees were picking up on the signal or changing the sort of composition of their leaves in a defensive way, let's say making them bitter or less nutritious, long before caterpillars arrived, and they were quite too far from the trees that were being attacked to be connected through their roots. So it had to be airborne chemicals, and that's been confirmed. And plants are doing this all of the time.
And so they're the same species of tree, Do people know if they are? Do researchers know if they're related?
No, they don't. They don't even need to be the same species in some situations.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah, I know. Could you imagine if we could communicate that directly with other species? That would be amazing.
This is awesome. We're working through the list of what makes up intelligence, right? So we've covered touch, we've covered communication. That memory is one as well, right? That you talk about in your book. How is that possible? What are plants remembering, and why?
So plants have all kinds of different types of memories. One is something that probably a lot of people are familiar with, which is this idea of the memory of winter. So a lot of our fruit trees, nut trees, bulb plants like tulips, so like peaches, almonds, tulips, hyacinth, they all need to experience an elapsed period of cold in the winter in order to bloom in the spring. So it's not enough for the warm weather to show up, and they won't respond to just the warmth. They actually have to have enough cold days stored in their memory, so to speak. There's kind of counting processes going on for a spring bloom to ever happen, which is why, if you live in Florida or something and you want to plant tulips, the garden store will tell you to put the bulbs in the fridge for a while before you plant them. Plants have more recently been found to have short-term memory storage. That's quite dynamic. There's a flower that grows high up in the Andes in Peru. It's in the Loazaceae family, and it's one of these bizarre alien-looking star-shaped flowers that have stinging barbs all over their stem. And that used to be the most exciting thing about them, was that they could deliver a wallop of a sting. But since about 2019, researchers have understood that plant is actually able to keep track of the time interval between the last pollinator visits it's experienced. So like if a bee comes by every 45 minutes, it will sort of keep note of that time interval and then only present its pollen on the schedule that it expects the pollinator to come by. Now, when researchers tried to test its memory and change the so-called pollinator visit, in this case, it was actually a researcher, to like every hour and a half, the flower would adjust quite quickly to that new schedule. So we know it's able to store these short-term memories and retrieve them in a way that's useful to them. But we have no idea where they store them. This goes back to the brain problem. Where those memories are stored is totally unclear to us. But of course, lots of things about our own memory, the kind of like physical storage of our own memory, is also a mystery.
Right, in that huge complex thing inside each of our noggins. Yes, hard to peel apart what does what there. And I would imagine with plants even more so, even though they seem like simpler forms of life. But there's my human bias again. Yeah. That is amazing about that plant that remembers the time intervals between visits from a pollinator, but then adjusts it as well. That's the fascinating bit, isn't it? If it becomes longer or shorter, it is adjusting its ways according to new circumstances. Reminds me of the sweet potato in your apartment. It's constant change, adaptation, moving with the needs of the moment that these plants are doing.
Exactly.
Okay, you've overloaded my brain, my central nervous system, with all this amazing stuff. Let's step back for a second. When did your deep dive in plants begin?
It began in, I think, about 2017 or 2018, when I had been covering climate change for 5 or 6 years in various newsrooms, and I was in my latest newsroom and feeling just really burnt out by that. Reporting on climate change is bleak stuff, as I'm sure you and everyone at the station knows. But I was sort of looking around for something I could cover in the natural sciences that felt more alive and vibrant and full of wonder to kind of pull myself out of this funk.
And there were too many people studying bears already, Will. That's my thing. So no kidding.
Well, bears are incredibly exciting.
You don't have to say that. But yes. So, sorry to interrupt your flow. Yeah, go on.
I'm more into the non-obvious forms of biology.
Okay, good answer.
But I had this great fortune of noticing that there's a paper coming out pretty soon about how the first fern genome had been sequenced. And fern genomes are absolutely massive things, which is why the genomic revolution had taken so long to get to them. And I thought, what the heck, I'll just cover this. It'll be a fun story. And I called up the fern researcher, and he happened to be at a fern gathering. He was at a botany conference. And he said, if you hang on a minute, I'll get a bunch more fern scientists on the phone So I ended up having this incredibly delightful conference call with about 6 or 7 fern researchers.
Oh,
and I
love it.
realized that they were the most wonderful people to speak to. They were all bursting at the seams with love for ferns. And I had never really experienced that from a scientist. And I'm someone who, talks to scientists for my job all the time. But there's a big difference between someone counting carbon dioxide concentrations in the air and someone in like deep reference for the incredible ecological history of a fern. So I decided to pursue that interest, and I stumbled into this world of fern science, became totally enamored with that, took a fern science class.
And I understand from your book that you have you got a fern tattoo.
Oh yeah, it's under the sleeve, so I can't show
Is
you.
it?
But
I'm not surprised it was that species that brought you in. You know,
Right.
there are and how appropriate that it's one of the most ancient plants on the planet. I guess that brought you into this world. Was it?
Exactly. That's kind of what really struck me, was that they had been steadily doing their thing for so much longer than humans have existed, than most animals have existed, and it's been unchanged for most of that time. In part because probably they've just figured out how to do something well and stuck to it. And that just sort of it led me to stumble into this world of botany that was uncovering absolutely remarkable things. It was just very good timing. This sort of taboo of the secret life of plants had worn off enough to unleash really out-of-the-box science. And I saw that botanists were fighting amongst themselves about whether or not they should be considered intelligent and consciousness. And like any journalist knows, when you find tension like that, that's already a good story. And it turned out to be the best story of my career.
And I sense this sound in your voice, this wonder and joy and childlike when you start talking about plants. Interesting that your work prior to this phase of your life was climate change and pollution and things that were kind of brought you down a little. How was it switching to plants?
Oh, exactly what you just said. I mean, it uncovered this sort of wonder in myself that I had not been in touch with since childhood. I think we can all think about our childhoods, and maybe the children in our lives are, innately, children are little naturalists. They experience the wonder in nature around them so readily, and have not been sort of tamped down yet by the rigors of the adult world. And it was an absolute delight to be put back in contact with that. And it put me back in contact with a sort of general truth, which is that the more you pay attention to the natural world, the more incredible it is. And it's an incredibly re-enchanting experience to start paying that kind of attention. So what it did was it brought me out of this office building, it brought me out of my computer, and it really put me in touch with organisms that are all around all of us all the time. I mean, they're right there. Plants are everywhere you look. Even in Brooklyn, in this very concrete neighborhood I live in, there's plants crawling up, the chain link fences, busting through cracks in the sidewalk. And now I can walk by them all and sort of acknowledge their incredible resourcefulness, because I know what it takes for them to keep persevering wherever they are.
It sounds like you have to set off earlier for meetings these days, maybe.
Yeah, it takes a little longer to walk through the park. It's true.
So many distractions. It'd be like me walking through the woods on my way to a meeting. I would just have to tack on half an hour just to stop and gaze. Everything you're saying just resonates so much with me, because there's nothing like a walk in the woods. And sometimes, I struggle to do it for exercise because it becomes more like a forest bathing exercise to me, where I'm stopping and looking and wonder at. These plants have been so successful and they're so dynamic, but they live in this hidden world that might be right under our very eyes sometimes. It's fascinating, isn't it?
I absolutely could not agree more. And I think it's worth noting that experience of wonder that you're describing is very powerful. I mean, there's a lot of research into what wonder does to the human mind, but also I read some of Rachel Carson's work towards the end of her life, and she wrote about wonder being this transformative emotion, that it actually promotes respect, that there's a sort of how awe sort of leads towards respecting the thing that you're awing at, yes, or experiencing awe towards, and that can be an emotion that helps people do ecological acts. And so I think we could all use a little more wonder, for sure.
I love that. And so much of it starts with curiosity, and it seems like you've got bags of curiosity, which leads to wonder, which leads to empathy, all of these important words for human beings that we can, learn by our wonder of plants. Every piece of broccoli that you eat or every mouthful of salad, are you thinking differently about it?
That would be really oppressive. No, not quite. I mean, I do think that this process has given me a certain reverence and thankfulness for plants that I think I had sort of reserved for animals in my mind prior to this, But we are fundamentally animals that need to eat plants to survive. And that can be, instead of being a source of guilt, that can be a source of thankfulness and continued respect. I mean, this is an interesting thing that I often get asked is what are the vegans going to do about this plant intelligence news? And I get why that question is being asked, but I think it's probably more productive for us to sort of recognize that the continuation of our lives requires some part of violence upon other things that have a willingness towards life, like plants. Plants want to continue living. And rather than that be something we feel vexed about, it could just be something we feel profoundly grateful about. And that gratefulness can translate to sort of less exploitation of plants. I mean, there's a difference between harvesting or taking enough for what you need to perpetuate your own life and sort of wastefulness. And that can be applied to different scales of our society and how we treat plant life and all life. But yes, we have to eat plants. Keep eating plants, everyone, please.
This word I can't help but think of as we're talking about anthropomorphization, anthropomorphizing plants and what they're feeling, what they're capable of, comparing it to ourselves all the time. Are there things that you feel we're missing out on about plants because we're thinking about their intelligence from our human perspective?
That's a great way to put that question. Are we missing out on something about plants because of our human bias? Surely, yes. I mean, certainly we've missed out on so much about plants for the last 150 years of Western science simply because of human bias or assumptions about what they could or couldn't do, primarily what they couldn't do. So it's only now that we're starting to see them, at least the scientific institution is starting to see them as dynamic. And I think it's just proof that every time science looks closer at plants, they find more and more dynamism. They find more and more spontaneous, responsive decisioning in plants than they thought was there before. So there must be large parts of plant being that we have yet to uncover. And that is probably primarily due to the human bias to assume that something without, let's say, a face could possibly be that decisioning or that complex.
Or advanced, yes. Do you feel like our minds are intelligent enough to understand them?
I think our sort of evolutionary heritage means that there's certain things we didn't have to pay attention to, perhaps, or are not inclined to pay attention to. Again, you have this issue of scales of time, for example. I mean, we exist in our own time scale, and it's much faster than plant time scale in terms of, let's say, watching a plant move. We can't really watch a plant move. It's just not part of our biological capacity because of how fast we move. So I think that difference in time scale really suggests that there are big limitations to what we can understand about plants. It takes a lot of willful attending to plants to see basic facts about them just because we're not attuned to that, which makes so much sense given our evolutionary heritage or lineage of, mostly needing to pay attention to animals moving quickly across a landscape, not necessarily the slow growth of plants, which of course to a plant is probably not slow at all. It's just growth, movement.
Yes. I've got to ask, it's all powerful, very profound stuff that we're talking about, really, because it touches upon so many meaning of life almost questions, and what the sources of life are, and what human life is versus other species on the planet that we share with other forms of life and other species. Has your life changed since discovering this much about plants? Do you go about your life differently in some way?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's hard to touch on one thing that it's done in a tangible sense, but what it's done to my outlook on the world is it's profoundly resettled me back into what is probably a much more accurate vision of where humanity rests relative to all other creatures on the planet, all other organisms. I was raised in a culture that sort of had this inherited idea of a ladder of life that puts, humans at the top and animals farther down, and then lesser animals, and then, plants, and then rocks. And plants being maybe less than a slug, but maybe slightly more than, a piece of granite. And, whether or not anyone said that to me, that's the wisdom I've inherited. And this process of learning about what plants can do and how interwoven they are with every other organism in their environment, then it's very hard to separate a plant from microbes and viruses and fungi. And recognizing the ways that's the same is true for us, that we are fully imbued with many other organisms, that we are entirely dependent on plants for all of our life processes, all of the sugar we've ever consumed, the oxygen, absolutely everything in our lives is mediated by plants. It really has settled me back into this place of recognizing humans are just one sort of node in this branching, tangled world of evolution. We are the most recent version of our little node, of our part of this evolutionary entanglement, and plants are the most recent node of theirs, each one of them a separate node. But there's not this kind of hierarchy. This is a sort of entangled mat.
What do you think can be gained by humans seeing plants as intelligent?
I think it would open up a world of ethics that might seem a little far-fetched to contemplate now, but it's worth considering that, the animal rights movement seemed very far-fetched to people, living, let's say, in the late 1800s. It's sort of a very recent phenomena that we care at all about animal ethics and how to act morally towards animals. There is already some concepts of what a plant ethics might look like that's sort of bubbling up in different parts of different professions. So, for example, the world of earth law, there's this sort of school of legal theory that's contemplating whether or not certain ecological entities, let's say a forest or a river, or individual species should have standing in a court. If the law should be able to see, let's say, a plant as a legal person, in the way that we already give standing to ships. There's a legal personhood for ships in the courts. They get the feminine pronoun. Or corporations, in the U.S. at least, have legal personhood standing in courts. So what would it mean to give that to, let's say, plants? So it's this move away from instrumentalizing them as something that can help people, but rather just having the right to exist as we would consider any human to have the right to exist.
Yes.
So that's a really interesting school of thought. But of course, this is also all hearkening to what Indigenous scientists and Indigenous cosmologies have always known in many cases, that this idea that plants as persons is very much central to plenty of Indigenous science. So I think it's also very exciting the way that Western science, so to speak, is sort of arcing towards this long-standing knowledge of Indigenous science.
Two-eyed seeing. We did an episode called Two-eyed Seeing that brings together those Western philosophies of science and Indigenous knowledge that was absolutely fascinating for those reasons. Okay, so begs the question, do you think plants are intelligent?
I am more interested to see how the sciences and society at large sort of come down on this question.
Oh,
I think I'm inclined toward it. I like to say that I like the word agency better. Agency, you don't even have to get into these messy human flecked words like intelligence. Agency suggests that plants, if they have some control over the direction of their lives, and that seems irrefutably true. Very clear to both scientists and to me watching scientists that plants have that agentive capacity. Intelligence is harder.
Thank you, Zoe, so much for this fresh perspective. I've loved this conversation. Zoë Schlanger is the author of The Light Eaters, How the Unseen World of Plant Intelligence Offers a New Understanding of Life on Earth. Zoe, thank you so much for this conversation. I've loved it.
Thank you so much. This has been so fun.
We'd love to hear what you think of The Wild. Which shows did you like the best? What would you like to hear more of? We have a survey in our show notes, and if you have a moment, please do fill it out because your feedback will really help us plan for future episodes. Thank you. The Wild is a production of KUOW in Seattle and Chris Morgan Wildlife, with support from Wildlife Media. The show would not be possible without listener support. You can help us continue to create this special immersive storytelling by donating to KUOW. Go to kuow.org/donate/thewild. Thank you. Lucy Suchek produced this episode. Jim Gates is our editor. The Wild is hosted, produced and written by me, Chris Morgan. A very special thank you for the kind financial support to Jill and Scott Walker, Rose Letwin, Ellen Ferguson, Anna Kimball, John Taylor, Paul Lister, Bob Yellowlees, Barbara Stolman and Barton Brooks. Our production team includes Roy Campanella III, April Craig, Marshall Eisen, Michaela Ginotti Boyle, Tatiana Latre, Matt Martin, Kara McDermott, Amelia Peacock, Darcy Riggin-Schmidt, Brendan Sweeney and Hans Twite. Our theme music is by Michael Parker. I'm Chris Morgan. I hope you enjoyed the show. Thank you for listening and keep in touch.